there a dystopian universe, reality, or society that you were like, this isn't too bad. I can live with this?
I think it would come down to A, how much of a lack of empathy and sympathy you had, or B, how much you wouldn't mind being kept in the dark.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a dystopia is an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible. From George Orwell's 1984 and Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, to young adult classics like Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games and Veronica Roth's Divergent, dystopian novels and movies have gripped society's attention, even though everything that happens in them sucks. But are they all so terrible? And are dystopian societies closer to us than we think? Guest writer Brad Allis joins me in a discussion of the dystopian trope, why we love to read and write them, and their small silver linings, if any. Welcome to the podcast, Brad. First, tell us a little bit about yourself and your interests in speculative fiction.
Well, spent years, a decade, in the media as a reporter and radio host. Transitioned that into local government, where a very wise and astute boss of mine challenged me to find a passion project. So I returned to writing a novel I had started 20 years before, and that has snowballed. I've now written 2 novels, and about 10 chapters into the third, I'm trying to find an agent. I write primarily detective and crime fiction, though do read quite a bit of speculative fiction, and starting with my obsession with comic books from about the age of 6 or 7 through now, where, movie, television, comics, and the like. So
what are your thoughts on dystopian stories in particular?
Well, I found it interesting because I find that I think the word dystopian has been broadened. To me, it used to be a bleak future, but now if you really look at it, I think a lot of things that are and aren't dystopian speculative fiction get branded as such. So I think it has broadened. But to me, originally it was a bleak future, but you see everything from post-apocalyptic to totalitarian government, which are pretty much 2 opposite ends of the spectrum of the change in culture and society.
Do you think a lot of that reflects then how we view ourselves as a society now and what we consider to be scary compared to our form of government, for example?
To me, it really... See, I'm a child of the 80s, so we thought we were going to get nuked at any time. So I think that's where you saw a lot of the post-apocalyptic stuff, but at the same time, you also had, and it's ironic that it's now rearing its ugly head again, you had the Soviet Union and their authoritarian government. So I think for many of the creatives of my age and a little older, we lived with that specter of both nuclear war, of 3 Mile Island, of Chernobyl, destroying the environment. And we also lived with dictators, like the Soviet Union, like Gaddafi. So it was present on our news at all the time. And I think that naturally crept into what we were reading. Both, like I said, it started with comic books as a kid, which became a more adult medium, and then into the sci-fi and fantasy that we read and still create to this day.
So then why do you think people like to read and write dystopian stories?
I think in many ways it can be a catharsis. I think you think of the worst case scenario in your fiction, and then it can make it so it's not as bad. I think it's also a way of commenting on what you're seeing every day. Again, that fear of nuclear war that we dealt with, and then you write about it and you think about it. You can make subtle points about the things you're seeing around you. You know, you look at a movie, maybe one of my favorite dystopian movies, They Live, John Carpenter's They Live, where no one knew they were living in a dystopian society, but it was a real commentary on the role of the government, the role of the media. It's very apt today as well. But if you haven't seen the movie, the main character, it finds a box of sunglasses that allows him to see the fact that actually the world is being run by aliens. And all the messaging in the advertising and on the news is actually subliminal messages that say obey or consume or procreate. And so again, it was a very, in some ways, ham-fisted commentary on consumer culture and the role of the government in that to placate us. But at the same time, it was a very entertaining movie that starred Rowdy Roddy Piper, the former pro wrestler.
Yeah, I that's what I love about dystopian stories is they're meant to warn and kind of scare and explore things, but at the same time, we just love them. And I think a lot of it has to do with we're intrigued by what we think we don't know and to prepare for any possibility. But I also think that people who write or read dystopian stories tend to display a lot of compassion and empathy because it's a way of exploring something that you may not yourself experience, but seeing how the adverse effects of your environment can affect you and the people around you.
Yeah, I think in many ways we look at other societies, even other time frames, and wonder how we would exist there. What would we do if we were in Ukraine today, for example? And I think a lot of that is, let's place ourselves in this bleak future, which might even be for some places a bleak present. And how would we react? Would we, take the Ukraine? Would you be running toward the Polish border, or would you hand your child off to grandma and grandpa and go to the front lines? And I don't think any of us, I think we know what we would do in that situation, but in reality, I don't think any of us know or would be confronted. I know, again, speaking as of when I was a kid, the movie Red Dawn came out, the original, not the remake with Thor. And, every kid in America thought, okay, when those Russians parachute into our playground, we're running to Mount Lemon with our dad's shotgun, when I think most of us would unfortunately wind up in the re-education camps or just be running the everyday town for the Russians and the Cubans. But it's something that always, made you think and consider, what would I do in this situation? What would I do? And I think, as we have seen, I kind of have joked for years that it still sometimes feels like we're in the first 10 minutes of the dystopian movie, where they show all the headlines and it's plague and bad leaders and war overseas and murder hornets. And would we be the character who is at the forefront of it, knowing what's going on? Or because it's such a slow digestion of all these things, would we be that character who midway through the movie, the protagonist runs into our house for shelter, and then we have to figure out, are we going with them on the adventure, or are we calling the authorities?
Dystopian stories are entertaining when it's not technically happening to you, and it becomes a fun thought experiment. But I thought that too. When growing up, I used to love reading these hypothetical scenarios and wondering what role would I play. And then the pandemic happened, and I remember being in the thick of it. And you and I have similar roles in our day jobs where we're very much involved in public communication and news. And I remember thinking, I don't like being in a dystopian situation at all. This is really stressful.
Well, I think the other thing that they didn't tell us in our dystopian literature of the 80s and even the 90s is we have become such a fragmented society, primarily politically, although I think you can say religious, not religious, that when we saw the dystopian societies on television and comics, 95% of the population bought in one way or the other. They were either all united against the aliens, or they were all fooled by the megalomaniac dictator. And what we've seen now is this such fragmenting of our society that everything that if you want to say all the dystopia is now, half of them like it and half of them don't. And you can almost not find anyone who crosses these lines. So, when it came to COVID, half wore their mask, half would never wear a mask. That was tyranny. When you look at, whether you like the current president or the former president, it was 50-50 split. There was no one like, yeah, he's okay. So I find that was something I don't think many of the writers, and I might be wrong. I don't read enough of dystopian fiction. Maybe someone has that pegged down, that they saw these slow, which I think was by design, by our political parties, by outside forces, to split us and to fragment us into two very distinct groups that are very much 50-50 or close to it. Whereas, you look at something like Animal Farm, and it was like the three leading, the pigs leading and everyone else behind. But here, I think it's a very interesting to see how fragmented we are, and it'd be very interesting to go back and look at other literature and to see if anyone pegged that, because it always seems like, either everyone was united or everyone was fooled.
So what would you think qualifies a society as dystopian by literary measures then? If you look at all the classics, you mentioned Animal Farm. 1984 is one that comes to my mind. What are your thoughts?
It really seems like it's one of two extremes, and to really go onto the geeky deep end, I played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, and you had the character alignments. The hero, the Superman was what was called lawful good. And there are three kinds of evil, but there are really two kinds of evil. There is chaotic evil, which is basically no laws, no rules. You murder, you rape, you pillage. Think berserkers and Vikings. And then there was what was actually the worst, which was lawful evil. And
and you're justified in your evil.
Or you were so tightly regimented in your evil. And ironically enough, if you picked up the books and with the monsters, there was a section on the devils. Not a devil, but there was, every version of the Judeo-Christian devil had its own different character. So there was Asmodeus, and there was Lucifer, and they were all lawful evil. So in many ways, when you look at dystopia, you've really got two. You've got the authoritarian regime. You've got your, Fahrenheit 451, your Animal Farm, your V for Vendetta. And then you have the opposite, which is the complete breakdown of society. Your
zombie thrillers,
zombie apocalypse, post-apocalyptic. And those seem to be, really the two main types that we see in literature. It's either the complete breakdown of society or the ultra regimented. And the irony is, in the ultra regimented, you have no freedom or little or no freedom. And in the other one, you have complete freedom, which is actually what causes all the problems.
So when you talk about that regimented authoritarian dystopian, that brings 1984 to me, definitely. Have you read that one yet, by the way?
I have not read 1984.
I'm ashamed to say I grew up not reading it either, until I finally was like, I need to read this book just to get my research done. And it's remarkable how much of it has been, I can see how people who are fearful of this sort of future regimented dystopia is alerted to a lot of the things that we're having right now in technological advancements, such as having screens that watch you and listen to you in your living room. But yeah, it's basically a high surveillance state, and you are subjected to conditioning throughout your everyday. They watch everything that you do, and they condition you against other countries, other races, through the use of, I'm trying to think of what the term is. It's when they make you watch something. It's almost like a Clockwork Orange, where you watch something and then they associate terrible things with whatever you've watched. So then you have physical reactions to it. And that's what these people have to go through every week. It's called the 2 minutes hate. I think that's every day, where it's torture conditioning to make people feel really unpleasant about their enemy, whatever this enemy is. And what's so scary about 1984 is that as events change, they go back and they rewrite history. And the main character's main job is to go back and start erasing headlines, rewriting headlines, and then destroying the original. And when you talk about information control, it actually makes me thankful that you can't edit a Twitter post.
Yeah, knowing a lot about 1984, and I always joke that I went to a TUSD high school, so I never read many of the classics. Although, ironically enough, we read The Trial by Kafka, which is a dystopian future where you are under trial for something that they won't tell you what you did or how to defend yourself in on an omnipresent jury. Um, but for the most part, yeah, we read a lot of junk, I would almost say, literature, except for 900 Steinbeck novels. But in middle school, we were exposed to not only Animal Farm, but at least selected chapters of Fahrenheit 451. But you mentioned 1984, and it's very interesting. Is a lot of it was a prediction of the future, but at the same time, it was taking things from the recent past. And you think about the conditioning to hate your enemy, and that comes right out of World War I and World War II propaganda, where the Japanese were made to look monstrous, literally, yellow devils. And you look at the way the Germans were they were these giant ogres. And we have continued to see that in the Jim Crow South, where we saw how blacks were portrayed, and unfortunately has even crept into until more modern fiction, where all your villains, all your drug dealers are black or Mexican or Hispanic, or all your terrorists for a while were always Arab. And I think, luckily, I think our fiction has gotten away from those stereotypes at least a little bit, but we still see that in political rhetoric. Whether it's painting border crossers as rapists and murderers, or the opposite, painting, we're having people who won't eat at a Russian restaurant in New York City, even though those people left Russia, because we're going to end up painting them as complete villains, even though the Russian government, I would say, is the villain in the Ukraine scenario, but not necessarily the Russian people. So in many ways, yes, it was trying to predict the future, and I think accurate in many ways, but it's also drawing on the recent past. And I think that, when done well, and if you look at dystopian, kind of comes into two categories. It can be throwaway junk fun fiction, zombie movies and things, which also always did have a slight political bent, whether it was consumerism or government control, or you have the very highbrow dystopian, like Fahrenheit 451, like 1984, like a lot of Kafka's stuff. So it's very interesting that a genre can be either complete sci-fi fantasy, the dystopia, or a very good commentary on society, or when done really well, which I think both speculative fiction, obviously, and science fiction to a degree, do it both ways, where it's very entertaining and you think you're reading, for lack of, watching a popcorn movie, but in reality, it is a subtle and sometimes effective commentary on society.
It seems like what we're really scared of is each other and the darkest side of human nature. One thing that I always find remarkable growing up is I'd always wonder why certain people were so worried about certain actions from other people, because it wouldn't dawn on me to be mean or authoritative. But there's a part of human nature that maybe some people are more in tune to or knowledgeable of, have been victim to, and are always aware, whether it's coming from like within and they see it reflected in others, or they have had to experience it before and they don't want to experience it again.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you mention, and I think we do see, and again, going back to the literature and to the movies and the comic books, we see people who are either conditioned to become authoritative. I'm going to use authoritarian, although I guess you could go with the chaotic, or conditions make them that way. And
Yeah.
again, there's still, you look at a Lord of the Flies, Battle Royale, which is a Japanese, basically, that became, it's the story that really spawned the Hunger Games. You look at The Walking Dead, where you can go one of two ways. You can become the bad guys, the ones who are raping and pillaging and betraying, or but that's, I think, can being, in many ways, reacting to. Where in others, and you look at, whether it's 1984 or Animal Farm, that's conditioning. That is finding those you can bend to your will and make think your way. And again, in most of these cases, the heroes is the one who either has the awakening or never gets the conditioning, or the ones who overcome those elements to remain at least as pure as possible. You look at something like the zombie movies. At some point, yes, there's a swath of destruction, but we see it as being justified destruction, because whether they're monstrous zombies or they're the bad humans, but yeah, that's where in these novels, in these movies, the hero is usually the one who overcomes this version of society to remain what we think is as pure or pure enough.
Can you think of an example of one character that you think is a really good example?
Of if you look at it, I think you could, if you want to go with like the Hunger Games, Katniss's character never fully buys it. She's given the ability to fully buy in to the Capitol, both in surviving the Hunger Games. She could have become a pawn, but does not. You look at The Walking Dead and Rick's character, who does some very dark things, but at the end of the day, he is still the hero. You even look at Ready Player One, which is a book you actually turned me on, and the hero doesn't sell out to the corporation. He when he does win, he doesn't pocket the money. He opens the oasis for everyone. So I think in most of these, we see the characters who remain as pure as they can, even if sometimes to remain pure, they have to, again, do dark things. Rick had to kill bad people to keep his family safe from zombies and from those bad people.
Okay, so now that we've talked about dystopian societies, how much they suck, how they affect story structure as far as characters are then focusing on trying to break free of those, whether they're authoritative or chaotic situations. Let's turn this concept on its head a little bit and talk about, now that we know that dystopian realities are a reflection of real life, it's not just looking forward, it's also looking back. Therefore, are we always in some sort of state of dystopia? We can talk about that as well. But what I want to know is there a dystopian universe, reality, or society that you're like, this isn't too bad. I can live with this?
I think it would come down to how much of a lack of empathy and sympathy you had, or B, how much you wouldn't mind being kept in the dark.
Okay.
I'm looking, and I made my list of all of these, the ones that I really liked. And you look at something like Snowpiercer, the movie. I've never seen the television, but in the movie, if you lived in the front of the train, things aren't so bad.
Mm-hmm.
Can you ignore the people in the back of the train? And I think most of us would say, I couldn't. Well, when was the last time you went down to the homeless camp? Or when was the last time you donated something to a third world country?
Right.
In many ways, the train in Snowpiercer is a shrunken version of our entire society. I use, in They Live, would you be happy being perfectly ignorant to what the aliens are doing? Most of the people were living fine lives. They were. And I think many people would argue, if you watch the movie now, it's kind of ironic with the whole fake news and consumerism and things like that. Many would argue we're all happily ignorant as we stare at our cell phones and we record our podcast on our laptops. And, but would you be perfectly content, being that person? Or in a lot of them, I always joke that, even in Ready Player One, we saw the people who live in the stacks. They're poor. Well, what about the rest of the people? What about the guy, what about they live in Columbus? Well, you and I, having worked in local government, how would you like to be the communications department for Columbus, Ohio, not knowing that everyone lives in the stacks, or not knowing? So I think there is a blissful ignorance in many of these societies.
It's like being in the Capitol for Hunger Games, and you get to
Yeah.
wear your makeup and your hair, and you're like entertained by all these poor children.
Well,
because it's easier to be ignorant at that stage.
Remember, they tell them that they do this so there'll be no more war. We're saving lives. by letting a few people, kill themselves. And I'm sure if you were, and it'd be fascinating to see a story told from the Capitol's point of view. And I think we see that a little with, what's her face, the PR person who doesn't get it. Well, you deserve this. You deserve to live like that. You lost. And I'm sure there was just like, well, you don't have the cognitive skills to work a high-tech job in the Capitol. That's why you mine coal. Or that's why you were in the fishing, I forget which district was the fishing one. So yeah, I'm sure if you're in the Capitol, you're just like, I think we saw that for years, well, if you can't get out of poverty, it's because you're not working hard enough, or it's because you're not taking advantage of your opportunities. Well, or maybe, you grew up, you were born outside of a dump in Guatemala and don't know how to get out. So I think there is a blissful ignorance that we probably all deal with, being middle-class citizens of the United States. So I think, but I think there are some dystopian societies that would be quite easy to live in. At the same time, the post-nuclear or post-zombie apocalypse would probably be a little bit tougher. We see those little societies, those little utopias that are carved out, but they always either have a dark side or they don't last very long. Whereas again, I think you could probably exist just fine at the front of the train, or not putting on the sunglasses and they live, or working a government job in the V for Vendetta autocracy or whatever it was. But yeah, so I think it depends. But then again, you could be Planet of the Apes, and you could be a slave, or you could be in Mad Max trying to mine what little water's left, and that's going to be a rough life.
There are two books that I've read that I consider to be dystopian, but I thought they would actually be kind of fun to live in. And all of it was based off of how much fun I had reading the world building. So the first one, I don't know if you've read, it's a Jason Pargin book. It's Futuristic Violence and Fancy Suits. Have you gotten to that one? I forgot.
Have not, no.
Okay. So this one takes place in the future, and it's this city called Tabula Rasa, it looks like it's replaced Vegas. It's now the center of all commerce and activity. It's a nonstop carnival ride. It is considered a dystopian society because of the lack of regulations. So there's rampant crime. The influencer and reality TV culture is on crack. And it's a surveillance state because social media everyone now has live cameras on their glasses, on their person, whatever, and they're constantly streaming themselves for their own motivations, right? Think any sort of live feature on any of our social media platforms. And as a result, because everyone is constantly streaming 24/7, you've lost your total freedom. And because the algorithms are so strong in this, it's called the Blink network, that your face can be instantly recognized in other people's. Now, if you're in trouble with the police, or you're on the run, it's impossible to hide, and which is the point of the story. So one thing I like about it, though, is progress is ridiculously fast. And because it's a surveillance state, if you mention to your friend, if I go, hey, Brad, I really wish there was a taco stand right here, the next day the taco stand will be there. And I'm sure there's there's tons of ethical issues. I'm sure that it's a very fun, fantastical concept. But if I was ignorant to whatever shady business had to happen behind the scenes, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, and I think if you look at that, that's basically just and we're getting to the point where it's going to be a mild exaggeration of what we already see. Mm-hmm. If you look at it, yes, we're not all streaming, but we're all carrying phones in our pocket. And we are, you mention something and it pops up on your Facebook feed so you can order it. And I'll tell you the craziest one. I just learned how this worked. When I worked with you, we had several people come into our office one day, and I noticed one of them worked for a construction company.
Okay.
And he had a really cool hat. Thought it was cool, wondered what it was. I didn't know if it was his company's logo. I did not have my laptop with me. I did not have my phone with me. They were at my desk. Within 48 hours, that hat popped up on my Facebook feed to purchase.
That's happened to you a couple times now.
I have finally figured it out.
Okay.
So what happens is sometimes, yes, you go to a site, you're going to get that popped up. You even if you mention it, what it does is not only triangulates your data, but the data of people with you. So since my phone was in close enough and my Facebook with his, and he obviously probably ordered that hat online, it's going to pop up things. So it's not that you mention it and it pops up, but what probably happened is your coworker or your family member or your neighbor mentioned it because they looked it up, and your phone is
Okay.
triangulating with their phone. So in essence, yes, you think it and it happens. But that's what Google and Facebook and all these are doing now. They've gone beyond just taking your search history. They're now commingling your search history with
Okay.
everyone else's, trying to give you even more options. So, you could say, hey, my neighbor has a really cool car in your head, and suddenly you got a Lexus ad. Well, it's because they went to Lexus.com.
So now you can feel bad about yourself if you can't afford
times.
that.
So this guy bought this hat, which was just from some actually local, company. It had a state flag on it of Arizona. And yeah, sure enough, a couple of days later, popped up on my feed, which I, again, thought was very strange at the time and was trying to figure it out because I'm like, well, I didn't mention it. I didn't look it up. Could somehow
It's reading your mind.
or did it did my phone reflect it but no, what it was his somehow search history, and the algorithm picked up that. So I didn't get a taco stand necessarily right down the street, which would be great.
I mean, it would be great for employment too if you could just say, I wish there was this, 500 person firm, and that'd be really beneficial to us. And then suddenly you can give 500 people a job.
But in many ways, we do see that in a weird way, because you got a lot of these people who are Amazon sellers and they are eBay sellers. And what happens is these things start popping up on the algorithm, and the companies they then order from are like, hey, there's a market for Arizona flag hats in Tucson. Do you want to start selling them for us? And so I think in a weird way, it can be an employment booster, just not in the way we all think. But again, is that really worth the trade-off of, you suddenly not only having your search history used for marketing purposes, but commingling again with your friends, your neighbors, your frenemies, your enemies.
So then, speaking of scary potential based off of what we're already seeing. So my second book, so both my books I've mentioned in a previous episode from the introduction. So I'm revisiting them now. The first one was Futuristic Violence in Fancy Suits. The second one is called The Body Scout. This one, I think you'd really like, Brad, because it's about baseball. And it's about a future where GMO and bionic companies have basically dominated the economy, and it's reflected in their acquisition of baseball teams. So the Mets is now owned by the Monsanto Mets, and people now have access to either GMOs, so chemical alterations to their body to be a really good baseball player, or bionic alterations where they can just, I need a new arm, literally, and I'm going to go get a metal one. And because in this society where they're both trying to compete to be the top, it's easy to create almost a civil war in the culture over, well, are you a GMO or are you bionic? And there's so many disturbing things, right, that you could think of, obviously, with tampering with your body in that way. However, the book explored some really great advancements in health and medical access that I thought were really great. And so then with a dystopian society here, and the reason why I consider dystopian is because people have lost aspects of their humanity as they've turned to modifications for corporate benefit. But at the same time, there's these little glimmers of, those are really great ideas if we could have just focused on those positives. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think, especially when we talk with the science fiction, I think all of the technological advances start out great. I mean, let's go to one of the greatest dystopian world building ever, the Terminators. I mean, it started as a great idea. We're going to protect everyone with Skynet till Skynet becomes conscious. And I think, you look at the computing power we have in our hand in a cell phone is infinitely more powerful than the biggest computer of the 50s. Mm-hmm. So yes, we can do remarkable things. I can pick up a map and show my kids where Ukraine is. At the same time, I can also, be monitored, be tracked, be, again, become this consumer target. So there's all different kinds of events. Same thing. Yeah. You look at even if you just want to go with the bionic, looking what we can do now for amputees, but imagine what it's going to be in 10 years. I forget, at one point I had took a tech class about 15 years ago, and he said technology was getting twice as powerful in 3/4 the time. And back then I was still using a flip phone. So look where we're at now. But what you could do with those arms, but who has control of that arm? Who has the
Oh
algorithm?
yeah. Especially if there's like if the arm is on Wi-Fi, like smart
Yeah,
devices in your house.
exactly. So does that mean uh, Uncle Fred says something against the government? They make me smack him. I mean, again, and again, that's what dystopian future is. We're taking the far extreme.
Yeah,
Um,
that might be okay. That one
yes,
situation that's humorous.
but or does suddenly I'm registered for one party, the other party's in control? Do my arms and legs not work on election day? So
Hmm.
I can't get out and vote. We've seen it even with the GMO stuff, that we're ability to grow crops, to the ability is there to feed the world with GMOs, but there's a lot being done now that the nutritional value in our fruits and vegetables is next to nothing compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago. That through all this tampering, it still tastes good, sometimes tastes better. Bugs don't eat it, but I was reading something, and I read a lot about small farming and sustainable farming compared to factory farming, and so again, it's a whole nother conspiracy. But there's a lot of people who believe, you have to eat 3 times the fruits and vegetables you used to get the same amount of nutrients.
Well, I do think it's really interesting. Like, I realize maybe we don't like bugs as a society, but do we want to eat something that a bug doesn't want to eat? I would think that would be a good indicator of
Well,
what's nutritious.
and if you're really an environmentalist, and I'm going to get my soapbox here, um, do we want the bugs dying so we can't feed the birds, who then can't feed the bigger birds, who then can't feed the mountain lion? There's
Yeah.
we always hear about the loss of animal life with farming, with animal farming, but what we don't hear is what's happening to the environment from monocrops and big farming, which has become a big business. It's not mom and pop. The destruction of soil because of some of these crops that shouldn't be grown in places they're growing, or again, the fact that the soil becomes poisonous, so we don't have earthworms, so we don't have birds, and because we don't have birds, we don't have this animal. There's a lot of issues, especially in a lot of the other countries, but we're starting to see in America where the whole ecosystem is getting messed up, and it's not because we're killing cows. It's because we're farming peas for pea protein that shouldn't be grown in the Midwest or whatever it is. So again, it's great that we can grow these crops cheaper with less pesticides, but there's also these trade-offs to the environment and to our personal health.
Brad, are we currently in a dystopian society?
I think it could be one of two things. Either I will say 3 things. One, we're either in the first 5 minutes of the movie. I used to do a podcast a long time ago, and we used to do called Apocalypse Watch, and we'd list off all the things, the hurricane season or the riots or this or that. But if you really want to go into a they live type thing, we very much could be, because of the mind control. Although I would argue this: if you were writing dystopian, and I don't know if that word was around, fiction in the 1700s, when you lived in your bustling city of 30,000, that bustling metropolis, and you envisioned cities where there were concrete roads connecting all the cities and there was you could argue that this is the dystopian society for the agrarian society we used to be. So I think it's, I think, yes. Probably in one form or another, we probably are, but it depends on your definition.
Okay, that's fair. So I have a thought exercise then, which takes us a little bit more into the fantasy realm. So bear with me here. We are suddenly contacted by aliens who turn out to be human. And then we find out Earth was intended to be a prison. And now they're checking to see if we, as a collective society, are ready to rejoin the greater humanity. What do you think would happen next?
So we're Australia, who again was a penal colony that developed. My guess would be we're not quite ready. Again, it depends how advanced that society is, or we're more than ready, depending if they are a peaceful society or if they're a warlike society.
My first thought was that we wouldn't believe them and then wage war, and they'd be like, yeah, We'll come back later.
That very well could be, or half of us would believe them, depending on,
Yes.
what how they believed in other things. But my guess is, yeah, if they were looking for soldiers, they'd probably sign us right up. If they were looking for people to peacefully coexist in their utopia, they're probably leaving us here.
I think that's fair. I think going back to what you were saying earlier about how the pandemic showed us how segmented we can become over a simple issue, I feel like if the current event can be turned into football teams, then it'll get broken down, and you're not going to have anyone aligned. You'll have those pockets of different discourse.
And it's just, I think, yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's really, it's not as black and white as I make it out to be, but I am stunned. And again, my main thing is social media, but friends too, who completely walk their party's line, who completely take all the talking points, even if it doesn't affect them or affects them adversely. I have a friend who is a staunch Republican, which I get from an economic thing for her point of view. Her family has been directly affected by gun violence. Staunch supporter of the Second Amendment and believes that people should have any kind of gun they want because that's what she hears on her thing. I have another friend who is diehard Democrat, who's also a devout Catholic. And if you really look at Catholicism, much of theirs is far more conservative than the Republican Party, but they will walk down every talking point of the Democratic platform, even though morally they're against it, but it's because they've almost been conditioned. Well, the Democrats are my side. I got to be a Democrat. I got to be a Democrat. I'm like, really, you're not. You're really about 75% Republican, about 25% Democrat. But so many people just want to regurgitate those talking points. And then the irony is they say the other side are sheep. I think there is a lack of discourse, of exploring, of debating, and of frankly finding a consensus. So I think, yeah, if you use the football example, in college football especially, I'm a University of Arizona fan, but I'm also a West Coast football fan. But when my team's playing, University of Southern California, I'm against them. But when University of Southern California is playing a team from Georgia, I'm for them. And that's how it really should be. Mm-hmm. We should be like, well, we should come up with a point scale. It shouldn't be Republican, Democrat, Libertarian. It really should be a continuum, a spectrum. Well, where do you fall on the spectrum? Well, I'm 3 points to the left on social issues, but I'm 2 points to the right on economic. But we don't think that way. We are, well, this talk show host said this, so I believe this. I mean, and just even look at, and then they all flip flop, and then we tend to flip flop, and that to me is what's, I think, infuriating. So I think if the aliens came down and said, "Oh yeah, we're all devout Christians," well, 50% of the population would go with them. The other 50% were like, "They're lying, they're bad," or the opposite, So I think you're right. I think a lot of people would not believe them, but I think if they fell into that fragmented segment of society, they would believe them. Because you want to hear what you want to hear. You want to have your ideas validated. And if the aliens validate your ideas, you're going to go with them.
What would you say is your favorite dystopian novel or movie?
I'm going to give you a couple from each category because I spent way too much time last night doing it. For novels, I really go to the Philip K. Dick stuff. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and The Man in the High Castle, which are actually a shared universe. One is German-controlled East Coast, and one is the Japanese-controlled West Coast. If you're not familiar, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is Blade Runner. Another one I really like is the Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle. And I would also add Swan Song, which is a post-apocalyptic novel by a horror writer named Robert McCammon.
Those are all great recommendations. I will admit I'm that terrible person that hasn't seen the entirety of the original Blade movie, but I have seen the follow-up with Ryan Gosling.
See, I'm the opposite. I just couldn't bring myself to see the sequel, but watched Blade Runner a lot as a kid and didn't understand it, and then got into reading Philip K. Dick and went back and revisited it. And there's quite a few differences, but obviously, but Philip K. Dick is, yeah. And you could actually add a Scanner Darkly to that too, which is also another dystopian view. He wrote a lot about dystopian futures of one way or another. So he was big on that.
Okay.
Running Man, the whole Mad Max series, and Akira, if you really want to get into the anime.
Okay.
And then finally, I will go with comic books. Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, which is Batman in a dystopian Gotham City. He has been retired and comes out of retirement when gangs kind of take over, and then the Joker's on the loose. The Watchmen, which is a little bit looser of a dystopian. And then 2 X-Men stories. One they made a movie of, Days of Future Past, and also Age of Apocalypse. So comic books really shaped a lot of what I think of dystopian. So those are my recommendations. I could go on and on to RoboCop or They Live, but I need time for you to actually wrap up here.
No, you're fine. But that actually reminds me of a conversation from a previous episode that's going to come out soon. So I need to know your answer to this. Who's the more interesting character, Superman or Batman?
Oh, you know my answer. It's Batman.
I agree. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, I have Batman tattooed on my back, so we should go to there. But to me, Superman's relatively boring. He's too powerful.
Think he's just too clean, too cut and dry?
Yeah, he's very much a Christ figure, really. Whereas Batman is far more interesting, has far more, I think, a better world building. I think a richer tapestry of villains, which really kind of can delve into mental health. I like Superman. I would love to write Superman because I'd really like to tweak with the mythos a little bit. I think way too much about this. Really, when I fall asleep, a lot of times I think about that. But to me, Batman's far more interesting character, darker, cooler looking. He's got the better car. I mean, yeah. So it's all Batman for me.
All right. So then I have prepared a series of rapid fire questions that I did not send you ahead of time because I wanted to get. You're already really good at answering things right on the spot. But here we go. You ready?
Sure.
All right. Are you a night writer or a day writer?
A night writer.
What is
For a second, I thought you meant like, the car show. And I'm like, what's day writer? But I much prefer writing at night.
Well, now I've given you a new story idea. Yes. Day writer. Favorite type of scene to write?
I have really gotten into writing out of sequence action scenes where as I found that my style is later in the book as the action is coming to a climax, I write shorter chapters and I jump around. So the character pulls out a gun, but then the next chapter is going to be, well, where do you get the gun? And I like doing that. So I do like action, although I will say that they're hard to write sometimes, especially with multiple characters. And I will actually bust out my son's action figures and army men and try to figure out where everyone's standing and things like that.
That's a good way to go. Currently, I'm writing an action scene and I'm so overwhelmed with all the choreography that I just write action scene. And then I go on to the next and I'm like, I don't know. I'm going to figure that out later, but it's going to be later. Okay. What's a story that you're dying to see out there?
Yeah, I kind of like anything where you turn what we know on its head. So I think it's hard to say because that's what I want to go like, oh, I wish I thought of that. Whether it's that's what I would say, where you take the thing we've seen over and over and give me a twist on it.
Okay.
So case in point, mine's not a huge twist. My main character of my novels is a 20-something-year-old detective. Because when I was 20-something, I realized all these detective books I read, they're all grizzled, usually older men, but sometimes women. They're all alcoholics, and they're all divorced, and or they're kids. Encyclopedia Brown. There wasn't at the time a Gen X detective, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to write that. That's what I like. I like when you say, okay, that's a really cool way. I'll give you a good example. Baby Driver. The getaway driver is usually the throwaway character in the book. Here it was not only the key character, but he had his disability. So I thought that was a fascinating take on that type of story.
If you were a character in a story, which would be worse? To die a brutal death and leave an impact on the story, or to fade away into obscurity, but you're alive?
What would be better?
Yeah, well,
Fade away, probably. Yeah.
okay. You're like,
Yeah.
it's
I don't
I don't
really
need to be a
want.
part of the drama.
Yeah, no, and I think again, I think that's why in many ways I think if I was the character in the dystopian novel, I'd be the guy who didn't know what was going on,
Fair
or maybe
enough.
think I did, but not be motivated enough to really.
You're like, I got a day job. I've got
Yeah,
kids to
I
feed.
talk about it when I had a few beers in my system. Did you realize that screen that the billboard's watching you? But would I go and spray paint the billboard black to keep it from watching me? No, I probably wouldn't.
That's fair. All right. So, Brad, finally, is there anything you'd like to promote?
At this time, no. Like I said, hopefully a year from, hopefully I'm going to be where you are pretty soon with an agent and shopping projects. But I do have a podcast. It's completely different. It's a University of Arizona sports podcast called the Wildcat Sports Report Podcast. Also, I guess you could find me on Facebook. I do something where I chronicle the lives of my children. My kids are adopted, so from foster care. So I wasn't allowed to take pictures and post them as little kids. So I do something what I call Reasons I'm a Horrible Father. And it's basically, someday that will be turned into a book as well. But right now, unfortunately, I don't have any projects you can go out and purchase. But if you want to hear me my takes on University of Arizona sports, or you want to read about my parenting mishaps, search me out.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. You are a wealth of knowledge as always, and I'm really glad that you got to sit down and share your thoughts on this topic.
Well, you made me do my research and made me think I don't even know if I, again, had a definition for dystopia or even speculative fiction before we started this exercise. So I felt like I can branch out. Now I have a list of about 107 books I have to go read sometime in the next, 20 years.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like yourselves. Join the conversation by following us on Twitter and Instagram. Interested in being in a future episode? Email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.